Hi friends, continuing to the chapter, the psychology, measurements of attitudes. In the previous session, we have studied about the attitudes and the conjunctive dissonance. Attitude measurements is performed frequently by the various fields such as sociology, economics, and the marketers for the different purposes. Attitudes cannot be measured easily like other psychological concepts. This lesson teaches that the different methods of an attitude measurement developed by the research workers. Understand the concept of an attitude measurement. Identify the different methods of an attitude measurement. Describe the experiment measurement techniques, direct self-report methods of measurement. List down the classical methods of measurement. Provide the advantages and disadvantages of these methods. Give the alternative to the direct measurements. Discuss the notion of an social disableability responses bias. Describe the implement methods of the measurements. Attitude measurements is perceptives. Social psychological routinely measures that attitudes when studying their courses, how they change and they impact on the conjunction and behavior. Attitude measurements is also frequently done by the political scientists, sociologists, economics and the other academics. Commercial market researchers are constantly engaged in measuring the attitudes toward the real and imagined customer produced and serviced. Beginning in the 1980s, all agencies of the US federal government initiated the survey to measure an attitude towards the service they provided. Other news media regularly conduct and report the surveys assessing the public attitudes towards the wide range of the products. One of the most consequent examples is the routine measurements of the Americans' approval of their president. To gauge the people's attitudes, researchers have used a wide variety of measurement techniques. These techniques have varied across the history and they vary across the professions today. This variation is due to both the varying the philosophies of optimal measurement and varying the availability of the resources that limits the assessment procedures. When attitude measurements was first formalized, the pioneer scholars presumed that an attitude could be accurately assumed only using a large set of questions that were selected via an elaborate procedures. Example, Likert in 1932 and Thrustone in 1928. But today, attitudes are most often accessed using single questions which are relatively simple wording and structures, and the variability of the approaching is striking, suggesting that there is not necessarily one optimal way to achieve the goal of an accurate measurement. Recently, however, the scholars has begun to recognize that the accumulating literate points to clear advantage and disadvantage of the various assessment approaches, so that many in fact be away or ways to optimize the measurement by making the good choices among the valuable tools. Furthermore, some challenging puzzles have appeared in the literature on the attitude measurement that it is stimulating a re-evaluation of widely shared presumptions. This makes the presence of a particular exciting time for reconsidering the full range of issues relevant to the attitude measurement. Attitude, like all the psychological contracts or laden, we cannot observe them directly, so attitude measurements depend on those attitudes being revealed in overt responses, either verbal or non-verbal. We therefore turn next to outlining the process by which we believe the attitudes are expressed, so we can harm those process to accurate the gauge that concerned. The method of an attitude measurement. The different methods of an attitude measurement developed by the research workers have been arranged by into six main categories. The judgment method, the method of an summated rating, the method of an scalegram analysis, the rating method, the unfolding techniques, the methods of latent structure analysis. Other methods of measuring the attitudes are the projective techniques developed by the psychologist whose approach is largely analytical and technically based on the measurements or the perceptual level on the paint of a hand of a subject, which was recently reported by the psychologist of a neo-behavioralistic school. The judgment method. The judgment method of an attitude testing or all varieties of a technique first reported by the Thrustone and Chafe in 1929. The two main factors in the judgment methods of item must be scaled. The respondent must be scored on the basis of their responses to these items. The first step to be taken by the investigators using this method is the definition of some issues towards which the attitudes might be measured, such as, for example, attitude towards the church, towards the conscriptions, toward people with HIV, or toward wars. The second step is the collection of a numbers of an statement which might be relevant toward the issue. These statements are presented to a number of independent judges who are asked to sort statement into the bills ranging from very unfavorable to very favorable. This sorting of a statement is very important of its the agreement or the disagreement of the judges about a particular item, which determines whether the item is to retain or discarded. It is, for example, an item was classified by some judges as favorable and by the other judges as favorable, as such an item would be deemed to be an ambiguous and it would be discarded. The final questionnaire consists of a numbers of an statements, usually about 20, on which the judges have reached a measure of an agreement as showing the degree of an favorableness or unfavorableness towards the issues which is to be investigated. When the questionnaire is presented to the respondent, he is asked to check those items with which he agrees, and the respondent final score on the attitude test is the average scale value of the item which he has checked. The method of summated rating. The method of summated rating was developed by Lickett in 1932. Although similar to the judgment method, is that it requires the definition of an issues and the collections of a number of statements. Lickett's technique, according to the Green, is based on a method than in use in the mental testing field. Lickett's method dispenses with the uses of an judges and the task of an category sortings. The statements were presented direct to the subjects in a pilot group who were asked to indicate their reactions with the 5 categories: strongly approve, approve, undecided, disapprove, strongly disapprove, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 score respectively. After the pilot survey has been scored, items with high correlation to the total score was retained as relevant to the issues under the contradiction. List items not showing a higher degree of correlation were rejected as being the poor statement. The resulting scale of the attitude was summated into an rating for or against a particular attitude. The relative merits of a judgment method are as used by the Thrustone and Chafe, and the method of an summated rating are used by Likert or discussed by Creeth and Scruffield, is who includes that from the point of a scale, construction neither shows any appreciable advantages over the other, that the scoring of each method is straightforward, that Likers method provides more information and it's slightly more reliable. But there is a little defective evidence on the validity of the actual test. The methods of an scaleogram analysis. The method of an scaleogram analysis was first reported by Gutzman in 1944, and it is based on the notion of an social distance scale first designed by Borges in 1925. Borges, who was trying to design a method of measuring attitudes towards the ethnic groups, selected a number of a statement which indicates acceptance or non-acceptance of a particular racial groups. These statements were arranged in an order of ascending the prejudice, and the respondent asked to indicate which statement he would accept. The respondent attitude towards the particular ethnic group is then measured by the closeness of a tolerated relationship. Although the Borges scale allocates the expressions of the degree of feeling of social distance, it is generally accepted that there is a high correlation between the social distance feeling towards an objective and the social and the personal attitudes towards that object. In 1944, Gutzman devised his own social distance scale by assembling the items in an cumulative form so that a person who responded positively to, say, items 4 on the scale responded positively to the item below this point. The Gutzman method also included a scalesman or a mathematical model designed to ascertain the relative degree of certainty. The method of rating. The method of rating is a more general method in which a judge or a judges rate the individual attitudes on the basis of a data drawn from some or all of the following sources of information. First, non-verbal behavior towards the object. Second, verbal statement relating to the object. Third, secondary expansive clues. Fourth, responses in a clinical type interviews. Fifth, personal documents. Sixth, immediate experiences. Seventh, response on projective test. Morgan suggested that the rating method is a crude and unreliable methods, and that despite the possibility of numerical assessment, there is no method of telling how reliable the result may be. Green, on the other hand, expresses the confidence in the rating methods, suggesting that it introduces a new aspects of reliability since the different judges will undoubtedly give the different ratings. 9. But the Green advocates that the use of some standardized interviewers rather than Hubbard's observation and refers to the Ebel's 1951 study on ladder reactability. The unfolding techniques. The unfolding techniques was the first presented in 1952, and it is, according to the Green, a type of an scaleogram analysis in which the respondent is again asked to rank the items in order of preference on a scale ranging from the strong disagreement to the strong agreement. Each item is viewed as having a fixed position which is determined by the tester on the scale. The respondent replies are located as an average positions on the scale, and the testers can thus show the relationship between the attitudes of the several subjects. As yet, the particular methods of analysis of such data has not been worked out. Green, while accepting these new tools for the attitude measurements, suggested that the respondent could be asked to indicate which statements were more pro than his own position and which were more claiming that such additional information would help in unfolding the process. The methods of an latent structures analysis. The method of an latent structure analysis was developed by Lazarus Fields in 1950, and it is an attempt to reformulate the theory of an attitude measurements. Whereas the more usual definitions of an attitude is a syndrome of an response constituency along a continuum. Lazarus seems an attitude as a discrete variable having only a few values. The methods of an latent structure analysis resembles factor analysis, and Green is of the opinion that the Thrustone's multiple factor analysis is a special cases of the general latent structure model extended to the continuous manifest variable. The method involves the use of an mathematical model, but it has been criticized on the grounds of difficult of the items selections and the statistical test of the goodness of it. Consequently, few attempts have been made to use the model. Green comment additionally that it is impossible to evaluate the utility of the class model until more empirical evidence has accumulated. During the past 30 years, the majority of the research workers seems to have used one from or another of the judgment method, but recently the tendency has been towards a combined approach using a combination of the judgment method and some from of rating. It is perhaps convenient to divide this research into two main categories: research concerned with attitude specifically directed towards the education, and research directed towards the more general social attitudes. Experiment measurements technique, direct self-report methods. With the perspectives of a measurement theory establishment, we can now turn to the procedures available for measuring the attitudes. We begin with a focus on direct self-reports that involve asking the participant experimentally to describe their own attitudes. Our discussion starts with a review of an relatively cumbersome measurement technique processed by the pioneer of the attitude measured nearly 70 years ago. Although widely appreciated, these techniques are rarely implemented these days in a favor of an simpler practices. We therefore review a range of an guidelines for optimal building, such as simpler measures and identify source of an random and systematic measurements error in response to them. Classic self-report measurement methods. The origin of elaborate attitude measurements via the direct self-reports lies in the work of Lois, Thrustone 1928, Renis Likert 1932, and Charles Osgood Susis and Tenobin in 1957. Each of these scholars developed a unique technique for measuring the attitudes with multiple self-report items that have strongly faced the validity. Thrustone equal appearing interval methods. The methods of the attitude measurements he proposed involved 7 steps of an material preparation. The first stage, entitled gathering or generating between 100 to 150 statements of an favorable or unfavorable evaluation of an object. Next, this is a set is edited down to set of 80 to 100 statements that seems to have the most potential to perform effectively in the large states. Then, between 200 and 300 judges place each statement into one of the 11 bills, with the bills defined as representing equally spaced points along the evaluating continuum, running from extremely negatively to extremely positive. Next, each statement is assigned a numerical value from 1 to 11. representing the place at which the each participant placed it, and that the mean and the variable of a numbers assigned to each statements are calculated. Statement with the larger variances are interpreted in the different way by the different judges. So they are adopted from the consideration. Then two or three statements, which means very close to each points along the continuum, are selected, thus yielding a final battery with a state of an statement that are equally spaced from one another. At this point, the measure is ready for the administration. Participants are asked to read all the statements and to indicate those with which they agree. Each participant is assigned an attitude scores by averaging the mean values of the statement that he or she endorses. Ideally, each participant agrees with just two or three statements pinpointing his or her place along the continuum. Likkert's method of summated rating. Rennie's-Likkert's in 1932 summated rating methods is less labor-intensive during the material preparation phase. First, the researcher prepared about 100 statements that express the position either strongly favorable or unfavorable towards an object. In contrast of Thurston method, statement expressing neutrally are not included here. A set of and preset participants are then given a set of 5 response options: strongly disagree, disagree, undecided, agree, or strongly agree, and are asked to choose one responses to express their views of each statement. For example, statement expressed variable views of object. Responses are scored as 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 respectively. For the statement expressing unfavorable views of the object, responses are scored as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 respectively. Each participant is then assigned a total score by summing his or her score on all of the items. Finally, for each item, each person's score is correlated with his or her total score, and the items with a low item to the total correlations are dropped. Approximately 20 items with the strongest correlation are retained for use in the final battery. When this final battery is later administered to the other samples, participant expresses their extent of an agreement or disagreement with each statement, and the total scores are generated accordingly for each participant. This produces a shared sum of a spirit of a thrust tone, but involves a unique features assessment of the validity for the each item via the item to the total correlation. Osgood, Suzy, and Tenauben's semantic differential. The semantic differential is the simplest and the easiest to administer of the landmark attitudes measurement technique. Through extensive development, researchers Osgood and his colleagues identified a set of an objective pairs that represent the evaluation dimension, including a good, bad, valuable, worthless, wise, foolish, pleasant, unpleasant, and others. Each pair anchors that ends of a 7-point rating scale, and participants select the points on each scale to indicate their evaluation of the object. Osgood, Suzy, and Tenauben in 1957 responses the scale consistent for a long horizontal line intersected by the 6 short vertical line dividing the original line into 7 sections. At the two ends of each horizontal lines were the two anonymous, such as the good and bad. Participants were instructed to mark a spot of an horizontal line to evaluate the goodness or the badness of an object. In addition, Osgood's et al. 1957 provided an extensive instruction explaining the meanings of all the points on the rating scale. Say for an example, for rating scale anchored on the end by the good and the bad participants were told that the end point labeled the good meant extremely good. The next point over meant quite good. The next point meant slightly good. The midpoint meant neither good nor bad, equal good and bad. The next point means slightly bad, and so on. The cinematic differential is the foundational techniques used most often in the research today, but it is typically administered, not followed, as good it is. 1957 procedures. Instead, the horizontal line is presented with no label on any point except that the end point, and those endpoints are not labeled extremely good instead of extremely good and bad instead of extremely bad. Typically, the scale points are scored 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, running from the most negative responses to the most positive responses, and the participant attitude score, the average of a score he or she receives on each items in the battery. Advantages and the disadvantages of these methods. All three of these foundational methods involve the administration of a larger set of questioning to measure a single attitude. Therefore, these approaches are time consuming and demanding for the participants. In addition, the thrust tone and like a procedure entail a great deal of an preparatory work up front prior to the administration of the battery to one's focal sample of the participants. However, these methods have at least two key advantages. First, administrating many items yields a final score that contains less random measurement errors. Allison in 1975. Second, the procedures have the advantages of being built using empirical evidence of an convergence of an interpretations across the people and the coloration validity of the statement. Unfortunately, the time pressure typical of the most data collections effort those days means that the researchers find it too difficult to justify expanding the resources necessary to build and then administer the full-blown thrust-in, Likert, or Osgood rating batteries to measure a single attitude. Therefore, the most researchers measures the attitudes using a very small number of questioning that have not been selected based on an extensive presenting and developing the work. These practices mean that there is a strong intensive to design these few items to yield maximally reliable and valid assessment. Alternatives to direct the self-report. Given that the direct self-report will only be valid if the participants are willing to describe themselves accurately, it is understandable that the researchers have wondered whether the motivational force might sometimes lead participants to the abandon this goal and to mispresent themselves, creating a different sorts of an measurement error. The notion of an social disability responses bias. The idea that the research participants might be researchers is not an impulsive proportions to be sure. For example, DeFoilo, Kachi, Kirklandall, Weyer, and Epstein in 1996 had the people complete daily diaries in which they recorded any lies that they have told during a 7-day period. On average period, people reported telling one lie per day, which some people tells many more than 91% of our lies involve mispresenting oneself in some way. This evidence is in line with an theoretical accounts from the sociology. Goffman in 1959 and psychology Sklanner and the Willow in 1989, accelerating that an inherent element of the social interaction is constructed an image of an one self in the eyes of the other in the purest of an relevant goals. The fact that being viewed more favorably by the others is more likely to bring the reward and minimize the punishments may motivate the people to construct the favorable self-imagine. There are, in fact, a number of reasons to believe that the motivations to lie answering the questionnaires might be minimal. First, when filling out an anonymous questionnaires, no rewards or punishments can be possibly be at a stock. And second, it is mostly survey and laboratory experiments that the participants' relationship with the researchers are so short-lived and superficial that a very little often consequences is at a stake as well. Certainly a small frown of an disapproval from a stronger stranger can cause a bit of an discomfort, but little more than that. The conjunctive task of the figuring out with responses to the each questions one is asked with a gamer, the most respect from the researchers is likely to be demanding enough to be worth doing only when the stakes significant. So perhaps there is not much dangerous here after all. Unfortunately, however, there is another potential sources of an systematic distortion in the responses to even the self-administrated anonymous questionnaires self-deceptions. Not only do the people want to maintain the favorable images of themselves in the eyes of others, but they also want to maintain the favorable images of themselves in the eyes of others, but they also want to have such images in their own eyes as well. According to many philosopher analysts, the purest of an self-esteem is a basic human motive and it is driven part by some inevitable realities as the prospect of the death. Some people may be motivated to convince themselves that they are respectable, good people and doing so many at a time until the misconstruct of the fact. If people fool themselves in this way, then of course such misconstructal will find it a way into the questioning responses. Even when the participants wants to accurately report their attitudes to an interviewer and or to the researcher, obviously it is a tricky business to fool oneself because the part of the mind would need to know that it is fooling another part. However, such descriptions can be so automated that the people may not be aware of it at all. Implement measure techniques. To overcome the problems with an intentional and unintentional distortion of a direct attitude reports, much research has explored using the measurement techniques, then keep the self-presentational concern for entering a person's deliberation of his or her evaluation in the first place. Such techniques have a long history in the attitude research, but have in recent years became more popular of the availability of increasingly sophisticated technologies. We shall discuss of the implement measures in the session. An abstractive behavioral observation responds lently on the physical measurements. Unobstructive behavioral observation. Unobstructive measures are the measures that do not require the researchers to intrude in the research content. Direct and the participant observation requires that the researchers be physically present. This can lead the respondent to alter their behavior in order to look good in the eyes of the researchers. A questionnaire is an interpretation in the natural stream of a behavior. Respondent can get rid of filling out of an survey or restfulness of an questions asked. Unobjective measures preventively reduces the biases that the research from the instructions of the researchers or the measurement instruments. However, unobservative measurements reduce the degree these researchers had a control over the type of an data collected. For some construct, there may simply not be any available unobstructive measures. Response lengthy. Response lengthy is the speed or an ease with which a response to a survey question is given after a respondent is presented with the question. It is used as an indicator or attitude accessibility, which is the strength of a link between an attitude object and a respondent evaluation of the objects, which while response latency has been used for some times in conjunctive psychology lab experiments, it is used in the survey came about more recently. In the telephone survey, response latency or measured in milliseconds as the elapsed time from where an interviewer finished reading a question until a respondent began to answer. Psychological measures are those that involve the recording any of a wide variety of an psychological processes including the heart rate and the blood pressure, galvanic skin responses, hormone levels and electrical activity, and the blood flow in the brain. Psychological measures indicates intensive and not direction. Psychological measures are sensitive to the variable over than the attitudes. Example, vigilance task lowers the heart rate, skin responses changes in the presence of the novel or ingrossual stimuli. The different methods of an attitude measurements developed by the research workers have been arranged by the Green 6 into 6 main categories which he calls the judgment method, the method of an summarized rating, the method of an scalegram analysis, the rating method, the unfolding techniques, and the method of latent structural analysis. The cinematic differential is the simplest and the easiest to the administer to the of the landmark attitude measurements technique. On abstractive measurements or the measures that don't require the researchers to intrude in the research content. Response latency is a speed or ease in which a response to a survey question is given after a respondent is presented with the question. Psychological measures are those that involves the recording any of a wide variety of an psychological processes, including the heart rate and the blood pressure, galvanic skin responses, hormone level and electrical activity and the blood flow in the brain. Attitude measurement. A procedure is when in which the individual attitudes and the responses are assigned quantitative values. Judgment method. An issues is defined first, then relevant statements about the issues are collected. The statements are given to some independent judges and asked to sort the responses from a very unfavorable to a very favorable to determine whether the item is to be retained or discarded. Summated rating. An issues is defined first, then relevant statement about that issues are collected. The responses is given to the pilot group and asked to score the responses within the 5 categories: strongly approved, approved, undecided, disapproved, strongly disapproved. Reading the items with a high coloration to the total score which relevance to the issues and rejects the remaining. Self-report. This involves asking the participant explanatory to describe their own attitudes. Response latency. It is a speed or eases which a response to a survey question is given after a respondent is present with the questions. Conjunctive dissonance and the personality as the social phenomenon. In the previous chapters, we saw that it is difficult to change the attitudes. Dissonance theory addresses the discriminance between the behavior and the attitudes. It addresses the attitude changes, while the self-perceptions theory explains the attitude formation. This lesson discusses how the attitudes can be changed through the different factors and the self-affirmations. Understand the concept of conjunctive dissonance. Identify the difference between the conjunctive dissonance and attitude change. Describe the self-perceptions. Compare between the conjunctive dissonance and self-perceptions theory. Discuss about the self-affirmation. Describe the dissonance and the psychological responses. Conjunctive dissonance. One of our most influential approaches is social psychology, having for the researching implications is that the human being had a tendency to seek the constancy in one's conjunction, that is attitude, belief and self-perceptions. First introduced by the Haiders in 1946. This principles of an conjunctive constitution implies us that our attitude changes because we are motivated to mainly constituently among our conjunctions. This seemingly simply conjunctive distance theory was proposed by the Finster in 1957. According to the Finster, we feel tension, that is the dissonance, when we became aware of two simultaneous inconstant of conjunctions. In order to reduce this unpleasant arousal, we often adjust our thinking. The classical examples of an conjunctive dissonance can be found in the Aesop's fable, The Fox and the Grapes, in which the fox sees some hanging the grapes and wish to eat them. After several failed attempts at reaching the grapes, he decided that the grapes are probably not worth eating anyway, that they are not yet ripe, or that are not too sour. Dissonance theory addresses the discrepancy between the behavior and the attitudes. We are aware of both, hence if we sense some hypocrisy, we feel the pressures for the change. In a classic experiments done by Flintster and the Carl Smith in 1959, students were asked to spend an hour on boring and tedious tasks. The example is turning a wooden knob again and again. These tasks were designed and to generate a strong negative attitudes after the subject had finished. The experiments asked some of them to do a simple favor. They were asked to talk to the next subject, that is actually that the experiment's assistant. Unlike that, the task was interesting and they will enjoy it. Some participants were paid $20, a huge amount back in 1959. For this, the another group was paid $1 and a control group was not asked to perform the favor. In the end, the subject were asked to actually rate the boring task. What do you think the results were? Answer the sentences given below or true or false. The group that was paid $20 for lying, though that the tasks were more interesting than those who paid $1, true. If you thought that the above is true, you are wrong. Contrary to operating the conditional principles that big rewards produce the big effect. Those in the group $1 rated the task more positively than those in the $20 and the control group. This was explained by the Feaster and Carl Smith as an evidence for conjunctive dissonance. I told that someone that the task was interesting and I actually found it boring. When paid only $1, the students were forced to internalize the attitude that were induced to express, because it is unpleasant to say something that you don't feel. Those in the $20 condition, however, had an obvious external justification for the behavior. I lied because I was paid $20 to lie, and thus experience the less diagnosis. People paid only a small amount of money have less justification for their inconstancy, tends to the experiences more dissonance, and hence changes the attitude more. This is referred to as the least lead to the more efforts. In 1969, Arison reformulated the basic theory by linking it to the one self concept. According to this interpretation, conjunctive dissonance clause does not arise because people experiences dissonance between the contradictory conjunctions. Instead, it occurs when people see their actions and conflicting with the normally positive views of themselves. Thus, in the original Feasters and Carl Smith studies, the diagenesis was between the conjunctions. I am an honest person, and the conjunction I lied to someone about finding the task interesting. One real-life example of conjunctive dissonance is smoking. It is widely accepted that the cigarette can cause the lung cancer. Yet virally everyone wants to live as long as an healthy life. The desire to live as a long life is dissonant with the activity of doing something that will most likely the shortest one's life. Smokers therefore should experience the tension produced by these contradictory ideas. Such tensions can be reduced by quitting the smoking, denying the evidence of a lung cancer. Only very heavy smokers get the lung cancer. My chances of dying in a road accidents are higher than that of dying for a lung cancer, etc. Or justifying the ones smoking. It helps me to control my weight because it is often easier to make excuses that it is to change the behavior. Dissonance theory leads to the conclusion that the human rationalize rather than be rational. Dissonance theory has implications for parenting. It suggested that the parents should aim to elect the desired behavior without the thrust, thus motivated children to internalize the appropriate attitudes. I am not watching the television because it is more interesting to play the outside as opposed to I am not watching television because my father will punish me if I do so. Another implications of the dissonance theory is after making a decision, post-decision dissonance. Let's say you bought an expensive pair of sunglasses from a store. You are feeling very happy because that it is what you wanted to buy for a long time. After buying it, you see a similar pair in another shop, priced at almost half the price you paid for it. What would you feel now? If you feel upset or anxious, you are experiencing the post-decision dissonance. Dissonance experienced after making a decision regarding the possibility of being wrong. So what do you do to reduce this dissonance? You must rationalize and change your perceptions. Find additional reasons or justification to support your choice and make your decision seems more attractive, assuming that the shop will not permit any return or exchange. You might decide that your sunglasses are better. The two are not really the same. The second shop might be selling fake sunglasses. Mine are real, branded, etc. This must not be true, but it would make you feel better. After making important decisions, we usually reduce diagnosis by upgrading the chosen alternative and downgrading the unchosen one. Some researchers keyword the cultural factors influences the operation of an conjunctive diagnosis. Although diagnosis occurs all around the world, it is less likely to influence the attitudes in the collective cultures like the arts as compared to individualistic cultures like the United States. After all, if your marriage is based on your parents' choice and you're not happy, you can say to yourself, I didn't like him at the first place. He was my parents' choice, as opposed to where your marriage is based on a personal choice. In case of later, the possibility of making an incorrect decision is preserved more as a threat to one's own self. How could I be so stupid? As opposed to how could my parents be so stupid? Thus, the desire to engage in conjunctivity consistent actions may not be uniform across the cultures. Conjunctive dissonance and the attitude change. Attitudes, as mentioned earlier, are indeed difficult to change, but there are many ways in which the attitudes could be changed. Many studies, as for example that of Wien et al. In 2009, demonstrated that the attitude changes also shows in an neural changes. They found that when the person's action conflict with the prior attitudes, these often changes the person's attitude to be more consistent with their actions. This phenomenon, known as in conjunctive dissonance, is considered to be one of the most influential theories in psychology. Using a Solomon four-group design, they scanned the participants with fundamental MRI, which, while the subjects argued that the uncomfortable scanner environment was nevertheless as pleasant experiences. They found that the conjunctive dissonance engaged the dorsal anterior cingulative cortex and anterior insula. They also reported that the activation of these regions tightly predicted the participants' subsequent attitude change. These efforts were not observed in the control group. Their findings elucidate the neural representation of an conjunctive diagnosis and support the role of an anterior cingulative cortex in detecting the conjunctive conflict and the neutral predictions of an attitude change. According to the Feaster's theory, there are basically two factors that affect the strength of an diagnosis. One, the number of an dissonant belief. The second, the important attachment of each belief. Hence, one can eliminate diagnosis by the following method. First, reduce the importance of the dissonant belief. Second, add more constant belief that outweigh the dissonant belief. Third, change the dissonant belief so that they are no longer inconstituent. As mentioned earlier, dissonance occurs when an individual has to make a choice between the two incompatible beliefs or actions. This dissonance created is very high when the two alternatives are equally attractive. This is akin to approach conflict, which creates a considerable tension. Attitude change is more likely in the directions of a less intensive, as this result in lower dissonance. This explanation could be a very effectively used in the attitude formation and the changes. In regards to the changing of an attitudes toward a certain community people, the integrated housing scheme provides a good example of an application of conjunctive dissonance. When people start living together and have to interact with each others for a various reasons, they got to know that each other's and many ideas and the beliefs about the other person belonging to certain community starts changing considerably as the experiences shows that these peoples are not as the individual through them to be. In course of a time, with the changes in the beliefs and the ideas getting stronger, the individuals is able to get over the negative attitudes and to change a positive more attitude. This is one way of changing the attitudes. Her dissonance is created by the fact and figures, and the individual reduces the dissonance by changing his attitudes. To cite another example, consider someone who buys an expensive car but discovers that it is not comfortable on the long drives. Dissonance exists between their beliefs that they have bought a good car, that a good car should be comfortable. Dissonance could be eliminated by deciding that it does not matter since the car is mainly used for the short trips, reducing the importance of an dissonated beliefs or focusing on the car strength such as safety, appearances, handling, thereby adding more constant beliefs. The dissonance could also be eliminated by getting rid of the car. But this behavior is a lot harder to achieve than changing the beliefs. Thus, the two important most principle of an conjunctive dissonance can be stated as that. First, dissonance occurs when a person has to choose between contradictory attitudes and behavior. Second, another principle is that the dissonance can be removed by changing the importance of an conflicting beliefs and acquiring the new beliefs that the change the balance or remove the conflicting attitudes or remove the conflicting behaviors. Self-perceptions. Self-perception theory, that is SPT, is an account of an attitude changing the developed by psychological Larry Burn. It asserts that the people develop their attitudes by observing their behavior and concluding what attitude must be caused them. The theory is continuative in nature, as the conventional wisdom is that the attitude comes prior to the behavior. According to this theory, the attitudes come about without assassinating the internal conjunctions and the moods. The personal logical reasons out and explain their over behavior rationally in the same way they attempt to explain other behaviors. Bem was an early critic of conjunctive dissonance theory. He proposed the self-preparation theory as an alternative expansion of the results of an Pfister and Carl Smith in 1959 study. In other words, people from undeveloped attitudes by observing their own behavior, much as they use the other people's behavior to infer what their underlying attitudes are. Applying the principles of the Pfister and the Carl Smith studies, Burn argued that the participant must be interfering their attitudes from their behavior without necessarily experiencing any dissonances. Thus, when asked, "Did you find the task interesting?" they decided that they must have found it interesting because that it was they have told someone. To test this hypothesis, Burn in 1967 presented a participant a description of an original study. You would recall that a subject or a study performed a boxing or a boring task and then was paid either $1 or $20 to tell any that it was a fun and interesting. He then asked the participants to guess the person's attitude towards the task. The participant did guess the subject in $1 condition would hold more or task being bored than those in the $20 condition. This reasons the subject who was paid $20 to say that the task was interesting really because he clearly did it for the money. However, the study who was paid $1 must have been honest because such a small amount doesn't just lying. Thus, the Ben's theory and the Pfister's theory made an identical predictions but offer different explanations. Dissonance theory predicts that the presence of an unpleasant testimonial or arousal, while the self-perception theory suggested that no negative drive states is involved in attitude formations. Attitudes are interfered from the behavior rather than the other way around, while the dissonance theory addresses the attitude change. Self-perception theory explains that the attitude formation. Dissonance theory explains what happens when we act contrary to clear the defined attitudes. We felt an unpleasant tension, so we modified our attitudes to reduce it. In situations where the attitudes are not well formed, self-reception theory explains the attitude formation. As we act and then reflect, we develop the attitude in a line with our actions. Thank you.